we're witnessing something quite extraordinary unfold before our very eyes. The financial architecture that has underpinned American power for the better part of 8 decades is showing unmistakable signs of stress, and the implications are absolutely profound. Now, what makes this moment particularly significant is the convergence of several critical developments happening simultaneously. Donald Trump has reached out to Mexico in what can only be described as an urgent diplomatic overture, seeking cooperation on matters that go far beyond the usual border discussions. But here's what's truly remarkable, and I must emphasize this because it's being vastly underreported in mainstream circles. China has been systematically accumulating gold reserves at a pace that is genuinely unprecedented in modern financial history. We're not talking about modest increases here. We're talking about a deliberate strategic repositioning that suggests Beijing understands something fundamental about the trajectory of the global reserve currency system. Meanwhile, the dollar is experiencing pressures that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, pressures that are forcing Washington into diplomatic positions that reveal a growing recognition of America's shifting geopolitical leverage. Now, let me walk you through what's actually happening here, because the full picture is considerably more complex and more consequential than what you're likely to hear from conventional sources. When we look at Trump's outreach to Mexico, we need to understand this within the broader context of America's deteriorating position in the global economic order. This isn't simply about immigration or trade in the traditional sense. What we're seeing is a fundamental recalibration of regional power dynamics, and Trump, whatever one thinks of his methods, appears to recognize that the United States can no longer afford to treat its immediate neighbors as subordinate actors in a unipolar world that frankly no longer exists. The relationship between the United States and Mexico has always been complicated, layered with historical grievances, economic interdependencies, and vast asymmetries of power. But what's emerging now is something quite different. Mexico finds itself in an increasingly advantageous position, and this is something Washington is being forced to acknowledge, however reluctantly. You see, as global supply chains fragment, and as the China Plus One strategy becomes the dominant paradigm in manufacturing and production, Mexico has become absolutely indispensable to American economic security. The nearshoring trend, which has accelerated dramatically in the past few years, has transformed Mexico into a critical node in North American production networks. Companies that once placed their entire manufacturing base in China are now diversifying, and Mexico, with its proximity to American markets, its relatively developed infrastructure, and its integration into USMCA, has become the primary beneficiary of this shift. But here's where it gets really interesting. Mexico is not simply accepting this role passively. The Mexican government understands its leverage, and it's using that leverage in ways that would have been unimaginable during the height of American hegemonic power. When Trump reaches out to Mexico for help, he's doing so from a position that is considerably weaker than the position the United States occupied even a decade ago. Mexico knows this, the Mexican leadership knows this, and they're responding accordingly, which is to say they're extracting concessions, they're demanding respect, and they're insisting on terms that reflect the new reality of regional power distribution. Now, let's turn to the other side of this equation, because what China is doing with gold is absolutely central to understanding the broader transformation of the international financial system. China's gold accumulation is not a new phenomenon, but the scale and the persistence of it over the past several years is genuinely remarkable. The People's Bank of China has been adding to its gold reserves month after month, and when we look at the numbers, when we really examine the trajectory, what becomes clear is that this is not opportunistic buying. This is strategic positioning for a post-dollar world, or at the very least, a world in which the dollar's dominance is significantly diminished. Gold, as we know, has historically served as the ultimate store of value, the asset that retains its worth when confidence in fiat currencies erodes, and what China is signaling through its gold purchases is a fundamental lack of confidence in the long-term viability of a financial system built on dollar hegemony. Now, some analysts will tell you that China's gold reserves, even with these substantial increases, remain relatively modest compared to its overall foreign exchange holdings, which are still heavily weighted toward dollar-denominated assets. And that's true, as far as it goes. But what matters here is not the current ratio. What matters is the direction of travel, the clear and unmistakable trajectory toward diversification, away from dollar dependence. We need to understand this in the context of what's been happening with the BRICS nations and the broader movement toward alternative payment systems and alternative reserve assets. China has been at the forefront of efforts to create mechanisms that bypass the dollar in international trade. The expansion of bilateral currency swap agreements, the development of the cross-border interbank payment system as an alternative to SWIFT, the increasing use of the renminbi in trade settlement, particularly with Russia and with various countries in the global south. All of this points to a deliberate long-term strategy to reduce the structural power that dollar dominance confers upon the United States. And here's the crucial point that often gets lost in these discussions. The power of the dollar is not primarily about trade. It's about the ability of the United States to impose its will on the international system through financial coercion. Sanctions have become the weapon of choice for American foreign policy, and the effectiveness of those sanctions depends entirely on the centrality of the dollar in global finance. When the United States can threaten to cut countries off from dollar clearing systems, when it can freeze assets denominated in dollars, when it can effectively exclude nations from the international financial architecture, it wields a form of power that is in some ways more potent than military force. China understands this. Russia certainly understands this, having experienced the full weight of Western sanctions, and increasingly, countries across the global south understand this as well. The accumulation of gold is part of a broader strategy of financial defense and ultimately financial independence. Gold cannot be frozen by a foreign government. Gold is not subject to sanctions. Gold represents tangible value that exists outside the architecture of Western financial control. And as China accumulates gold, as it encourages its citizens to hold gold, as it integrates gold into its financial system in increasingly sophisticated ways, what it's doing is building the foundations for a monetary system that can function independently of Western control. Now, the question that naturally arises is, why now? Why is this happening with such intensity at this particular moment? And the answer, I would suggest, lies in the acceleration of dollar weaponization and the growing perception internationally that the United States is willing to use its financial power with decreasing restraint and decreasing regard for the long-term consequences. The freezing of Russian foreign exchange reserves following the invasion of Ukraine was a watershed moment. It demonstrated to every government in the world that holds dollar reserves that those reserves are not truly theirs, that they exist at the sufferance of Washington, and that they can be confiscated if the United States deems a country's behavior to be beyond the pale. This was an extraordinarily consequential decision, and I don't think the full implications of it have been adequately appreciated in Western policy circles. What it did was destroy the fundamental premise of reserve currency status, which is the assumption of safety and neutrality. A reserve currency is supposed to be a store of value that transcends political disputes. The moment you turn it into a political weapon, the moment you demonstrate that holding reserves in that currency exposes you to political risk, you undermine the very foundation of its reserve status. And this is where we come back to gold, because gold becomes attractive precisely when the alternatives become politically risky. China looked at what happened to Russia and drew the obvious conclusion. If the United States is willing to freeze the reserves of a nuclear-armed great power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, then no country is safe. The weaponization of the dollar, intended to strengthen American power, is in fact accelerating the diversification away from the dollar and the search for alternatives. We're also seeing this play out in the physical gold market in fascinating ways. The flow of gold from west to east has been relentless. The Shanghai Gold Exchange has become the most important center for physical gold trading in the world. Central banks across Asia, the Middle East, and increasingly in other parts of the global south have been net buyers of gold, while Western central banks have largely ceased to be active participants in the gold market. This geographic redistribution of gold reserves is mirroring the broader shift in economic power from west to east, and it's creating the preconditions for a very different kind of international monetary system. Now, when we talk about the dollar falling, we need to be precise about what we mean, because the dollar's decline is not primarily about its exchange rate against other currencies, although that's certainly part of the story. What we're really talking about is the erosion of the dollar's structural role in the international system. We're talking about the declining share of global trade that's denominated in dollars. We're talking about the declining share of global reserves that are held in dollars. We're talking about the emergence of alternative payment systems that don't require dollar intermediation. This is a slow-motion transformation, but it's gathering momentum, and the accumulation of gold by China and other countries is both a symptom of this transformation and a driver of it. The implications for the United States are profound and frankly quite disturbing for American policymakers. The exorbitant privilege that the dollar has conferred, the ability to run persistent current account deficits, the ability to borrow at preferential rates, the ability to export inflation, all of this depends on the dollar's continued dominance. As that dominance erodes, the structural advantages that the United States has enjoyed begin to disappear. The costs of servicing America's enormous national debt, which is now well over $30 trillion, become significantly more burdensome if the United States has to borrow at rates that reflect actual market risk rather than the subsidy that reserve currency status provides. This is why Trump's outreach to Mexico, and more broadly, the Trump administration's recognition that the United States needs to shore up its regional relationships, is so significant. As the global system fragments, as we move from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, control over regional spheres of influence becomes absolutely critical. The United States cannot maintain its position globally if it cannot maintain stability and alignment in its own hemisphere. And Mexico, as I mentioned earlier, is central to that project. But Mexico is not the only factor here. We're seeing a broader pattern of American efforts to rebuild alliances and partnerships that have been strained by years of unilateralist policies and by the perception, which is widespread internationally, that the United States is a declining power that can no longer be relied upon to maintain the international order. The challenge for American policymakers is that reversing this perception requires not just rhetoric, but substantive changes in policy and, frankly, a recognition of the limits of American power that has been politically very difficult to acknowledge domestically. The interplay between these various dynamics creates a kind of feedback loop. China's gold accumulation signals lack of confidence in the dollar. That lack of confidence encourages other countries to diversify their reserves. That diversification reduces demand for dollars. Reduced demand for dollars makes it more difficult for the United States to finance its deficits. More difficult financing conditions force the United States into positions of greater diplomatic flexibility, which is a polite way of saying weakness. That weakness encourages further diversification away from the dollar, and round it goes. What makes this particularly challenging is that there's no obvious way to reverse the process once it's begun. The United States could, in theory, restore confidence in the dollar by demonstrating fiscal discipline, by reducing its national debt, by running trade surpluses, by behaving in ways that would make the dollar attractive as a store of value on its own merits, rather than simply by virtue of historical inertia and network effects. But the political economy of the United States makes such a course of action extraordinarily difficult. The constituencies that benefit from dollar dominance, the financial sector, the national security establishment, they're deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. The constituencies that bear the costs of dollar dominance, particularly in the manufacturing sector, have been weakened by decades of deindustrialization. Meanwhile, China is playing a very long game. Chinese policymakers think in terms of decades, not electoral cycles. The accumulation of gold is part of a comprehensive strategy that includes the Belt and Road Initiative, the development of alternative financial institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the expansion of renminbi internationalization, and the creation of technological infrastructure that can support a China-centric economic sphere. This is not reactive policy. This is proactive construction of an alternative order. And here's what's truly remarkable about the current moment. We're witnessing these tectonic shifts in real time. But the dominant narratives in Western media and in Western policy circles remain remarkably resistant to acknowledging the full extent of what's happening. There's still a tendency to view these developments as temporary disruptions, as challenges that can be managed within the existing framework, rather than as fundamental transformations that require completely rethinking the assumptions that have guided policy for the past several decades. Trump's approach, whatever its flaws, at least represents an acknowledgement that something has changed, that the old playbook is no longer working. Whether his specific policies are well designed is a separate question, but the recognition that the United States needs to rebuild relationships, that it needs to secure its supply chains, that it cannot simply dictate terms to other countries, that recognition itself is significant. It suggests an awareness, however incomplete, that American power is not what it once was, and that maintaining American influence requires adaptation. The gold question is intimately connected to all of this because gold represents an alternative to the existing system. As long as the dollar-dominated system appeared stable and unchallengeable, gold was marginalized, dismissed as a barbarous relic. But as confidence in that system erodes, as the political risks of holding dollar reserves become more apparent, gold re-emerges as a relevant asset, not because its intrinsic properties have changed, but because the alternatives have become less attractive. China's massive accumulation of gold is a bet that this trend will continue, that the future international monetary system will have a significant role for gold, whether as a direct backing for currencies, as a settlement asset for international transactions, or simply as a reserve asset that provides insurance against monetary instability. We should also consider the domestic political dimensions of this within the United States. The erosion of dollar dominance has implications for American living standards, for the ability of the government to fund social programs, for the distribution of economic power within American society. These are not abstract theoretical concerns. These are issues that will affect the daily lives of ordinary Americans. And yet, the public discourse around these issues remains remarkably impoverished. There's very little serious discussion about what the decline of dollar hegemony would mean for the average American household, for employment, for purchasing power, for the cost of imports. This is where the connection to Trump's Mexico outreach becomes even clearer. The attempt to secure supply chains, to bring manufacturing closer to home, to reduce dependence on China, all of this is in part a response to the recognition that the United States may not be able to continue running massive trade deficits indefinitely, that there may come a point where the rest of the world is no longer willing to accept dollars in exchange for real goods and services, at least not at the current terms. Nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, whatever term you want to use, these are all attempts to prepare for a world in which American economic power is more constrained, more limited, more dependent on what the United States can actually produce rather than what it can purchase with printed currency. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is that these adjustments are happening reactively rather than proactively. The United States had decades to reform its economic model, to address its trade imbalances, to invest in productive capacity, to maintain its manufacturing base. Instead, policy choices were made that prioritized short-term consumption over long-term production, that allowed the financialization of the economy, that facilitated the offshoring of industry. And now the bill is coming due, and it's coming due at a moment when the international environment is considerably less forgiving than it was during the unipolar moment. China, meanwhile, has been preparing for this transition systematically and deliberately. The accumulation of gold is just one piece of a much larger puzzle: the development of domestic technological capabilities, the securing of access to critical raw materials, the building of infrastructure both domestically and internationally through Belt and Road, the cultivation of diplomatic relationships across the global south. All of this is part of a coherent strategy to position China advantageously for the multipolar world that is emerging. Whether that strategy will succeed is an open question, but what's not in question is that there is a strategy, that it's being implemented consistently, and that it's already having significant effects on the international system. So when we step back and look at the full picture, what we're seeing is a fundamental reordering of global economic and financial power. Trump's outreach to Mexico reflects the United States' need to adapt to this new reality. China's gold accumulation reflects its preparation for a post-dollar world. The decline of the dollar, gradual though it may be, represents the unwinding of the post-World War II financial architecture. And all of this is happening simultaneously, creating a period of extraordinary uncertainty and extraordinary opportunity, depending on where you sit in the international system. The countries and the leaders who understand what's happening and who adapt accordingly will be well positioned for what comes next. Those who cling to the assumptions of the past will find themselves increasingly marginalized in a world that no longer operates according to the old rules. And that fundamentally is what this moment is about.